A single caravan did more than carry silk. It transported entire worldviews across continents. Ancient trade routes were not just commercial channels. They were powerful engines of cultural transformation. These networks created echoes that still shape our lives today. By the end of this journey, you will understand how the modern world was woven together by these ancient exchanges. We will travel the Silk Road where Buddhism spread and papermaking revolutionized societies. We will cross the Sahara where gold funded legendary libraries and Islam blended with local traditions. How did a simple trade in spices lead to the fusion of entire cuisines and belief systems? What everyday part of your life might be an unexpected echo from a trader who lived 1,000 years ago? Language itself holds the whispers of these ancient journeys. Think about the word sugar. It originates from the Persian shakar, which itself came from the Sanskrit shakara. This sweet substance traveled from South Asia through the Middle East and into European languages carried on the tongues of merchants. Or consider the word orange, tracing back through Persian narang to the Sanskrit naranga. These are not just words, they are cultural echoes. The lasting and often unexpected impact an exchanged idea has on a society long after the initial contact. A cultural echo is not a direct copy, it is a transformation. The concept of zero began in ancient India. It traveled through the Arab world where it was refined before finally reaching Europe. This single idea did not just add a number, it fundamentally altered mathematics forever, enabling everything from advanced calculus to computer code. We see these echoes in our daily meals. A food like noodles likely moved from China westward along the Silk Road, and over generations, it transformed in places like Italy into what we know as pasta. The original idea was adapted using local wheat and techniques to create something new and beloved. This is the heart of a cultural echo. It is the ripple effect of a single trade. An idea that lands in a new culture is remade and becomes something entirely its own, yet forever connected to its distant origin. To truly hear these echoes, we must now walk the routes where they began. The name Silk Road suggests a single path dedicated to a single luxury, but the reality was a sprawling, messy network of countless trails and sea lanes, a pulsating artery system for the entire ancient world. While Chinese silk was the legendary product that gave the route its romantic name, it was merely the packaging for something far more revolutionary. The true cargo was intellectual. Think of a merchant caravan, its camels laden with bolts of shimmering silk. Woven into the very fabric of that material, however, were ideas. One of the most profound was Buddhism. Originating in India, it hitched a ride with these traders, monks, and pilgrims. It did not simply arrive in Central Asia and China as a finished product. It adapted, blending with local Taoist and Confucian traditions to create entirely new schools of thought, forever altering the spiritual map of the continent. This was not a delivery, it was a conversation. Another silent traveler was the technology of paper. For centuries, the Chinese guarded the secret of turning pulped fibers into a durable, cheap writing surface. But secrets have a way of slipping out along well-trodden paths. The knowledge traveled west, and when it reached the Islamic world, it sparked a revolution. Suddenly, books were no longer prohibitively expensive objects scribbled on rare parchment or fragile papyrus. Knowledge could be copied, shared, and stored on an unprecedented scale, fueling an explosion of scholarship in Baghdad and beyond. This ancient network functioned much like our modern internet, a system where the most valuable thing being transmitted was not the physical object, but the world-changing idea it carried. This pattern of trade transforming into cultural fusion would be repeated with its own unique rhythm on a completely different stage under the blazing sun of the Sahara. While silk moved overland, a different kind of treasure was crossing the oceans. The demand for spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves became an unstoppable force, pulling European ships around the globe and stitching together the coasts of India, the Middle East, and the distant Spice Islands. This was not merely a quest to season food. It was a hunger that would redraw the map of human connection. The true power of a peppercorn or a clove was not in its flavor, but in its ability to carry entire cultures across the sea. As merchant dhows and later European caravels plied these maritime routes, they became floating bridges for ideas. Southeast Asian culinary techniques and ingredients sailed west, infusing themselves into the cuisines of the Middle East and North Africa. Think of the complex spice blends that define those regions today. Many of those flavors began as cargo on a ship, but the most profound exchange was spiritual. The spice trade became the primary vessel for the spread of Islam to the far-off Indonesian archipelago. Muslim traders did not just sell their goods and leave. They established thriving communities, intermarried with local populations, and built mosques. Over generations, this created a lasting religious and cultural footprint that defines Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation to this day. The flavor of this exchange settled deep into the soul of societies, transforming beliefs and daily life with the same quiet power we can observe in another great theater of trade beneath the vast and silent Sahara. The Sahara was a golden highway connecting worlds. Caravans of thousands of camels, known as the ships of the desert, did not merely transport salt south and gold north. They navigated an ocean of sand to exchange the very foundations of civilization. The wealth from this trade was staggering, but it was not hoarded in royal treasuries. Instead, it was invested in something far more enduring: knowledge. In cities like Timbuktu, the profits from gold and salt built legendary universities and libraries that attracted scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. These were not small collections, but vast archives containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, law, and poetry, written in exquisite calligraphy. Timbuktu became a beacon of intellectual light, a direct result of the commerce flowing across the desert. Alongside these scrolls and books traveled faith. Islam spread down these trade routes not through conquest but through connection. Merchants and scholars introduced their beliefs, which then engaged in a long, quiet conversation with local African spiritual traditions. The result was not a replacement but a fusion, a new cultural synthesis visible in the very architecture of the region. The great mosques of cities like Didnt were not copies of Middle Eastern designs. They rose from the earth itself, built from sun-baked mud bricks in a uniquely West African style, their towering forms and wooden supports perfectly adapted to the local climate and materials. This was a cultural echo in its purest form, an idea embraced and then remade into something profoundly local and new. The Sahara, a seemingly impossible barrier, proved to be a powerful conductor for the human mind. This same resilience, the ability of trade to overcome even the most daunting environments, would find its parallel in the unpredictable winds of the Indian Ocean. The monsoon winds did not just bring rain, they brought the world closer together. For centuries, these predictable seasonal patterns created a clockwork rhythm for a vast maritime highway across the Indian Ocean. Sailors could trust the winds to carry them from East Africa to India, and then wait for their reversal to bring them home. This reliability built something extraordinary, a network of bustling, multicultural port cities that thrived on exchange. In places like Zanzibar, Calicut, and Malacca, the docks were a symphony of languages. Arab dhows, Indian junks, and Southeast Asian vessels crowded the harbors, while merchants from countless backgrounds bartered in crowded markets. These were not just trade posts, they were melting pots where people lived, intermarried, and built communities together. One of the most lasting echoes of this exchange is the Swahili culture along the East African coast. The Swahili language itself is a living testament, a beautiful fusion of Bantu grammatical structure with a rich vocabulary borrowed from Arabic, Persian, and even Hindi. This was not a language imposed by conquest, but one that grew naturally from the docks and marketplaces, a practical and poetic tool for connection. The artifacts left behind tell a silent but powerful story. Archaeologists digging on the coast of Kenya or Tanzania routinely find fragments of exquisite Chinese porcelain, once used in the homes of wealthy African merchants. Meanwhile, in China, artisans were carving intricate designs into African ivory, creating art for emperors. These objects are more than just antiques, they are physical proof of a deeply interconnected world, a globalized network that flourished long before European ships ever rounded the Cape of Good Hope. This was cultural fusion at its most organic, born from the simple, repeated act of trade. These ancient echoes of connection inevitably make us look at our own modern world, to search for the hidden threads that still bind us to those bustling, cosmopolitan ports. Our own speech is a museum of ancient journeys. Every time you say the word checkmate during a game of chess, you are speaking a fragment of Persian. The term comes from Shahmat, which means the king is helpless, a phrase that rode into countless languages alongside the game itself as it moved from India through Persia and into the wider world. This is not an isolated example. The English language is a tapestry woven with threads from everywhere. Your morning coffee is named after the Arabic kahwa. Your cotton clothing gets its name from the Arabic qutan. Even the word sugar traveled from the Sanskrit shakara through Persian and Arabic before sweetening the languages of Europe. These are not just borrowed terms, they are fossilized evidence of deep cultural contact, marking which societies were the great innovators, the powerful traders, or the administrative masters of their day. When a culture introduces a new technology, a new food, or a new concept, its name often comes along for the ride, embedding itself in a foreign tongue. Look at Swahili again, where the word for book, kitabu, comes directly from the Arabic kitab. This single word tells a story of merchants and scholars arriving on the East African coast, carrying not just goods but literacy and new forms of knowledge. Each of these words is a living reminder that every trade negotiation, every shared meal, every conversation between merchants was a potential moment of linguistic exchange. This proves that ancient trade was never a one-way monologue. It was always a dialogue, a two-way street where words, like goods, changed hands and found new homes. This constant, quiet exchange of language naturally paved the way for something even more profound, the travel of entire systems of belief that would reshape continents. The goods exchanged along these ancient roads were tangible, but the most profound cargo was entirely spiritual. Trade routes became superhighways for religions, carrying entire worldviews across continents where they took root in unexpected ways. Buddhism, for instance, began its journey from India, moving along the Silk Road not as a rigid doctrine, but as a set of ideas in constant conversation with the cultures it encountered. As it traveled through the high passes into Tibet, across the plains of China, and over the sea to Japan, it absorbed local traditions. It blended with Taoist philosophies in China and with indigenous Shinto beliefs in Japan, eventually giving rise to entirely new and distinct schools of thought. The serene, minimalist practice of Zen Buddhism is a perfect example of this transformation, a unique spiritual expression born from the marriage of Indian Buddhist principles with Chinese and Japanese sensibilities. This was not a conversion but a creative fusion. A similar story unfolded with the spread of Islam. While military conquest played a role in some regions, its expansion across Southeast Asia and much of Africa was predominantly peaceful, carried on the trusted networks of Muslim merchants. These traders arrived in port cities and trading centers, establishing communities built on reputation and mutual benefit. Their faith slowly permeated local societies, often blending seamlessly with pre-existing animist and Hindu traditions. In places like Indonesia, you can find rituals where Islamic prayers are woven together with ancient animist offerings to the spirits of the land. In West Africa, Sufi Islamic practices merged with local spiritual beliefs, creating a unique and deeply personal form of devotion. This cross-pollination of spiritual ideas created hybrid belief systems that are a testament to the fluidity of faith. Deities were reinterpreted, rituals were adapted, and philosophies were debated and transformed in the caravanserais and marketplaces. Commerce did not just move spices and silk, it provided the channels through which the human soul could explore new ways to understand the divine. And just as these spiritual echoes reshaped continents, the very structures we build to honor our beliefs tell a parallel story of adaptation and exchange. The stones themselves began to speak a new, blended language. As belief systems traveled, they needed physical homes, and the architecture that resulted became one of the most visible and enduring cultural echoes. Builders did not simply replicate foreign blueprints. They interpreted them, weaving new spiritual needs into the familiar fabric of their own architectural heritage. The Great Mosque of Xi'an in China is a breathtaking example. At first glance, it resembles a traditional Chinese temple complex, with its sweeping, upward curved pagoda roofs, courtyards, and wooden pillars. But this is a functioning mosque, its entire layout oriented toward Mecca. Instead of the domes and minarets typical of the Middle East, the mosque's minaret is a majestic, multi-tiered pagoda. It is a perfect fusion, a place where Islamic worship found a home within a distinctly Chinese form, creating something uniquely beautiful and spiritually resonant for its community. Across the world, in the heart of Spain, the Alhambra Palace tells a parallel story of synthesis. This fortress complex is a masterpiece of Moorish architecture, a style that originated in North Africa and the Middle East. Its creators employed intricate geometric patterns, calligraphic inscriptions from the Quran, and serene courtyards with reflecting pools, all core principles of Islamic design. Yet, the Alhambra was built in Granada using local materials, and after the Christian reconquest, was even expanded upon by Spanish rulers. The result is not a purely foreign implant, but a structure that feels organically rooted in its Andalusian landscape, a breathtaking dialogue between cultures frozen in stone, tile, and garden. This fusion extended beyond the grand monuments to the very art that adorned them. The swirling arabesques and floral motifs that cover the walls of the Alhambra, designed to represent the infinite nature of creation, influenced European decorative arts for centuries. Similarly, the techniques of Chinese porcelain makers, their secret formulas for blue and white glaze, traveled westward and were eagerly adopted and adapted by Persian and later European artisans, creating entirely new ceramic traditions. Every tile, every carved wooden beam, and every painted vase was a potential vessel for a borrowed idea, remade into a local masterpiece. These structures and objects are not mere relics. They are permanent proof that when cultures connect through trade, they do not just exchange goods, they collaborate, creating a shared aesthetic legacy that outlasts empires. This silent conversation in stone and art reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of exchange, a truth that becomes startlingly clear when we trace the journey of a single, world-changing idea. Artistic expression proved to be one of the most fluid and treasured exports of all. A statue of the Buddha from the ancient region of Gandhara presents a fascinating puzzle. His face is serene and classically proportioned. His robes fall in soft, realistic folds that cling to his body. This is not the abstract, symbolic Buddha of earlier Indian art. This figure looks remarkably like a Greek god, a direct result of Hellenistic artistic influences that traveled east with the armies of Alexander the Great and lingered for centuries in the bustling trade hubs of Central Asia. Greek sculptors and their local apprentices had fused their traditions, creating a new visual language for Buddhism that would eventually influence statues all the way to China and Japan. This was not a case of one culture simply copying another. It was a creative collaboration, a dialogue in stone and stucco that gave the divine a familiar yet entirely new face. An even more vibrant conversation unfolded in ceramics. For generations, Chinese artisans had perfected the art of blue and white porcelain, a brilliant white canvas adorned with cobalt designs. When this exquisite pottery reached the Persian world, it caused a sensation. Persian artists adored the technique but began painting it with their own distinctive motifs, lush floral patterns, and intricate geometric designs that reflected their own aesthetic. These Persian interpretations were then shipped back to China, where Chinese potters, seeing their own craft reflected through a foreign lens, began incorporating these new Persian-inspired patterns into their work for the export market. A continuous feedback loop of creativity was born, where it became impossible to say where Chinese art ended and Persian art began. The beauty of a single porcelain vase became a product of multiple cultures, its journey etched in glaze and pigment. This artistic cross-pollination reveals a profound truth. Aesthetics were a universal currency, as negotiable and valuable as any chest of pepper or bolt of silk. When a merchant transported a tapestry or a sculptor migrated along a trade route, they were not just carrying objects, they were carrying entire ways of seeing the world, visual vocabularies that could be learned, blended, and reborn into something unprecedented. This shared heritage of beauty, woven from countless threads of influence, is a legacy that still speaks to us from museum cases and ancient ruins, a silent testament to the collaborative nature of human genius. The flavors on your plate are a direct inheritance from these ancient exchanges. Our global pantry was assembled piece by piece through the routes we have walked, a culinary legacy written in spice and seed. Consider the humble chili pepper, a fruit native to the Americas. After Portuguese traders carried it across the oceans, it landed in India and Southeast Asia. There it was embraced with such passion that it is now impossible to think of Thai curries, Sichuan mapo tofu, or Indian vindaloo without their fiery kick. This was not a simple addition to the spice rack. It was a revolution that altered the fundamental flavor profiles of entire continents, creating new culinary identities that feel ancient and intrinsic, yet are surprisingly recent in the grand scope of history. A similar story of transformation unfolds with pasta. While Italy has perfected the art, the idea of noodles likely traveled westward from China along the Silk Road. The concept was adopted, but then it was reinvented using local durum wheat to create the dense, chewy textures that define Italian pasta today. The original idea was adapted into something uniquely its own, a perfect example of a cultural echo resonating through our daily meals. Perhaps the sweetest echo is that of sugar. Originating in New Guinea, the knowledge of cultivating sugarcane was refined in India and the Middle East. Arab innovations in large-scale sugar refining turned it from a rare luxury into a viable commodity. As it traveled to Europe, it did more than sweeten tea and desserts. It fueled the rise of the coffeehouse culture, changed festive traditions, and tragically, later fueled the demand for the transatlantic slave trade, a dark reminder that these connections could carry profound consequences. These ingredients did not merely diversify our diets, they rewrote agricultural calendars, changed what farmers planted across entire regions, and created new social rituals centered on shared meals. The global dinner table is a living museum, and every bite tells a story of a journey that began 1,000 years ago. Perhaps the quietest traveler along these routes was also the most powerful. Practical knowledge, the blueprint for a new tool or technique, could slip across borders unnoticed, only to reshape a civilization from the ground up. Consider the simple stirrup. This device, likely born on the steppes of Central Asia, gave a mounted warrior a stable platform from which to fight. When this idea finally reached medieval Europe, it did more than change how knights jousted. It created a new class of heavily armored, highly expensive cavalry, which in turn cemented the entire feudal system of land for military service. A small piece of leather and metal carried along trade routes had altered the social and political structure of a continent. An even more profound navigational tool came from the Islamic world. The astrolabe, a complex brass instrument of dials and plates, allowed sailors to calculate their latitude by measuring the angle of the sun or a star above the horizon. This was not a toy for scholars, it was the key that unlocked the oceans. European explorers, adopting and refining this Islamic technology, could now venture far from the sight of land with greater confidence, setting the stage for the entire age of exploration that would connect the globe. But the greatest technological transfer of all came from the East. A package of Chinese innovations traveled westward together, each one a seismic shock to the societies that received them. Gunpowder, initially used for fireworks, would revolutionize warfare, making castles obsolete and shifting the balance of power from knights to kings with cannons. The magnetic compass, a Chinese divination tool, became the indispensable guide for every ship at sea, and the printing press, while famously reinvented in Europe, built upon centuries of Chinese advances in movable type and papermaking, a technology that would shatter the monopoly on information and fuel the Renaissance and the Reformation. This was never a story of simple adoption. Each culture that encountered these tools tinkered, improved, and redirected them. The European printing press used a different alphabet and a more durable alloy for its type than its Chinese predecessors. The astrolabe was modified for different seas. This relentless adaptation proves that trade routes were not just delivering finished products, they were transmitting seeds of innovation, ideas that would sprout in new soil and bear unexpected fruit, fundamentally redefining what a society could achieve. Yet the very connections that spread ideas could also transmit invisible devastation. While merchants carried silk and spices, they unknowingly transported another, far deadlier cargo. The same caravanserais that hosted philosophical debates also hosted fleas, and the same ships that carried porcelain also carried pathogens. This was the dark underbelly of globalization, a tragic echo that traveled silently alongside the treasures. The most infamous of these was the Black Death. This plague, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, is believed to have originated in the steppes of Central Asia. From there, it hitched a ride in the fur of rodents or on the fleas that infested trading caravans, moving relentlessly along the Silk Road. By the time it reached the bustling ports of the Black Sea, it found its way onto merchant vessels, spreading throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The result was one of the most catastrophic demographic disasters in human history, wiping out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in just a few years. This was not a localized tragedy. It was a pandemic made possible by a connected world, a grim reminder that the routes of commerce were also superhighways for disease. Centuries later, a new wave of connection unleashed a similar catastrophe. Following Christopher Columbus's voyages in 1492, the Columbian Exchange began transferring people, plants, and animals between the Old World and the New. But the most devastating transfer was immunological. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Europeans had developed some resistance over centuries, were utterly alien to the indigenous populations of the Americas. These illnesses swept through the continents with a terrifying speed that far outpaced the European explorers themselves. Societies with no prior exposure were defenseless. The consequences were apocalyptic, with some estimates suggesting up to 90% of the native population perished. This catastrophic loss of life led to the collapse of mighty empires like the Aztec and the Inca, fundamentally and tragically reshaping the demographics of two entire continents. These were not mere outbreaks, they were historical turning points, unintended consequences that demonstrate the profound complexity of these ancient networks. They carried the seeds of both Renaissance and ruin, proving that the same bridge that allows for the exchange of art and ideas can also carry a shadow. The story of trade is not a simple tale of progress. It is a story of profound duality, where a single route could lead to a golden age in one city and a mass grave in another. The flow of goods and people demanded a new kind of order, a framework of rules that could stretch across kingdoms and cultures, with merchants from Venice trading with their counterparts in Cairo or Constantinople, whose laws would apply when a shipment was lost or a contract was broken. Out of this practical necessity, a remarkable system was born, the law merchant or lex mercatoria. This was not a legal code written by kings, but a set of common commercial principles that evolved organically in the bustling marketplaces and ports of medieval Europe. It was a law of the merchants by the merchants for the merchants, based on customs, fairness, and swift justice administered by their own peers. This system created a predictable environment for trade, allowing a German banker to confidently do business with a Flemish wool merchant, knowing that a shared set of rules protected them both. It was an early form of international law, an echo of cooperation that laid the groundwork for our modern global financial systems. Meanwhile, in the sophisticated trading hubs of the Islamic world, another revolutionary system was taking shape to solve the problem of moving vast sums of money across dangerous distances. The check or sack was an Islamic innovation. A merchant in Baghdad could deposit his gold with a banker and receive a paper note. He could then travel to Cordoba in Spain, present that note to an associate banker, and receive his money in local currency. This eliminated the immense risk of carrying chests of coin across thousands of miles. Furthermore, sophisticated credit and partnership agreements were developed to finance massive trade expeditions, spreading risk among many investors. These Islamic financial instruments did not stay contained. They traveled along the same routes as the spices and silks, deeply influencing the practices of emerging European banks in cities like Venice and Genoa. The very idea of a reliable, paper-based financial system was a cultural echo that reverberated through time, making the modern world of finance possible. These legal and administrative frameworks were the invisible architecture that held the entire edifice of ancient trade together. They transformed chaotic exchange into regulated commerce, embedding principles of contract, trust, and cross-border cooperation into the very DNA of statecraft. This legacy of governance, born from the caravan and the dockyard, proves that the most enduring echoes are not always made of stone or spice, but of the abstract and powerful ideas of order and mutual agreement. These trade networks did more than move goods, they moved people, planting the seeds of new homes in distant lands. Far from their ancestral homelands, diaspora communities took root in bustling port cities and caravan towns, creating a permanent human presence along the trade routes. Jewish merchants, for instance, established a vast and resilient network that stretched from the Mediterranean deep into Central Asia. Their ability to maintain trusted written communication across vast distances and their presence in many different cultures made them invaluable intermediaries, connecting markets that otherwise had little direct contact. In the ports of Southeast Asia, another community flourished. Chinese merchants settled in places like Malacca and Manila, creating distinct districts that buzzed with the language and customs of their Fujian and Guangdong homelands. These were not just temporary visitors, they were settlers building new lives. They formed the backbone of maritime trade between China and the rest of the world, their loyalty to their home empire balanced by a pragmatic need to integrate into their new local societies. The true power of these communities lay in their unique position as cultural bridges. A Jewish trader in Cairo might read a religious text from Babylon while conducting business in Arabic and living under Fatimid rule. A Chinese merchant in Java would maintain a shrine to his ancestors according to tradition, while also learning the local language and marrying into a Javanese family. They were living in two worlds at once, and this dual identity made them perfect conduits for a two-way flow of ideas. They introduced their host societies to new foods, technologies, and business practices from their homelands. At the same time, they sent back to their native lands not only profits, but also news, artistic trends, and foreign perspectives gathered from their adopted homes. These enduring transnational networks, bound by kinship, faith, and commerce, created a form of early globalization that was deeply personal, built on trust and family ties that could span continents. To cross an ocean, you first had to learn to read the sky. The relentless drive of commerce demanded new ways to conquer distance and the terrifying emptiness of the open sea. This was not a task for the faint of heart, but for the brilliant minds who turned the heavens into a map and the sea into a known road. Arab and Chinese navigators were the true masters of this art. They perfected the magnetic compass, a Chinese invention that transformed a mysterious natural force into a reliable northern guide. No longer were sailors solely at the mercy of the stars on cloudy nights. They could now point their prows with confidence into the deepest, most featureless waters. Alongside the compass, the astrolabe became their celestial calculator. This intricate brass instrument, refined by Islamic scholars, allowed a navigator to measure the angle of the sun or the North Star above the horizon, translating that arc into a number that revealed their latitude, their position north or south on the globe. It was like having a key to the universe's own grid system. In the Mediterranean, a different kind of map emerged from the salt-stained tables of ship captains. These were the Portolan charts, and they were utterly practical. Drawn on sheepskin, they were less concerned with religious cosmology and more with the brutal realities of a sailor's life. Their pages were a spiderweb of room lines, direct routes radiating from compass roses that showed a captain exactly what heading to steer to get from one port to another. Every cove, every headland, every dangerous shoal was meticulously recorded, a collective memory of the sea written in ink and parchment. This knowledge was not hoarded in royal libraries. It was a living, breathing intelligence passed from one generation of sailors to the next. In the Indian Ocean, this wisdom took the form of an intimate understanding of the monsoon winds. For centuries, Arab and Indian sailors memorized the rhythm of these powerful seasonal systems. They knew the summer winds would blow steadily from the southwest, carrying their laden house from Africa to India. They knew that when winter came, the winds would reverse, blowing from the northeast to carry them home. This predictable clockwork allowed for a maritime highway of astonishing scale and reliability, turning the vast ocean into a seasonal commuter route. These scattered pieces of knowledge, from the compass needle to the wind chart, were more than just tools. They were fragments of a single, colossal intellectual achievement, a shared understanding of the planet being pieced together by thousands of anonymous travelers. This collective echo of navigation did not just make the world smaller, it made it predictable, a place where a merchant could plan a voyage across thousands of miles with a reasonable hope of success. It was this very foundation of mapped seas and charted winds that later European explorers would inherit, the essential puzzle pieces they would use to launch their own voyages into the terrifying and alluring unknown. A gold coin minted in Constantinople could buy silk in a Chinese market. This astonishing reality was made possible by the silent, universal language of standardized value. When merchants from 100 different cultures met, they faced a fundamental problem. How could you trust the weight of a stranger's silver or the purity of his gold? The solution was a cultural echo that still underpins every transaction you make today. Powerful empires whose coins were renowned for their consistent weight and reliable metal content saw their currency become a global brand. The Roman denarius was so trusted that it circulated for centuries, even long after the empire that minted it had faded. The Byzantine solidus, known for its unwavering purity, became the dollar of the medieval world, accepted from the markets of Venice to the caravanserais of Central Asia. This was not just about convenience, it was about building a framework of trust where none had existed before. A merchant no longer had to carry scales and acid testing kits to every deal. The stamp of a distant emperor was a promise, a guarantee that allowed commerce to flow faster and farther than ever. Alongside these coins, systems of measurement also converged. The weight of a measure of saffron or a bag of peppercorns had to mean the same thing in Alexandria as it did in Antioch. Over time, commonly accepted units for precious goods emerged, a shared vocabulary of quantity that transcended language barriers. This push for standardization was a quiet revolution. It did not erase local cultures, but it created a neutral, common ground where value could be negotiated with confidence. It was the birth of a universal economic grammar, a set of rules that allowed the world to do business. This invisible architecture of trust, forged in ancient marketplaces, is the direct ancestor of the complex global financial networks that power our modern world. A caravan's most fragile cargo could also be its most indestructible. Tucked away in saddlebags and wooden chests, alongside bolts of silk and sacks of spice, were bundles of parchment and paper. These were not mere goods, they were frozen thought, the captured ideas of philosophers, storytellers, and scientists, traveling farther than the merchants who carried them. One of the most dramatic journeys began with the works of ancient Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Plato. In the vibrant intellectual capital of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom became a beacon where these Greek texts were not just stored, but passionately studied, debated, and expanded upon by Islamic scholars. They translated them into Arabic, adding their own profound commentaries and groundbreaking insights in fields like medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Centuries later, this enriched body of knowledge began to filter back into a Europe emerging from its so-called Dark Ages. Scholars in places like Toledo, Spain, began translating these Arabic versions of Greek philosophy, along with the original works of Islamic scholars, into Latin. The return of Aristotle's logic and Plato's ideals, now filtered through centuries of Islamic scholarship, hit the medieval university like an intellectual lightning bolt. It challenged entrenched worldviews and provided the kindling for the explosion of art, science, and humanism we call the Renaissance. Europe did not simply rediscover its own past, it received it back, transformed and amplified by a different culture. This was not a lost and found story, it was a conversation across time, mediated by the ink of scribes and the routes of trade. Stories proved to be just as mobile as philosophical treatises. A collection of ancient Indian animal fables known as the Panchatantra, filled with wise jackals and cunning rabbits, embarked on an epic journey of its own. It was carried into Persia, where it was translated and adapted as the Kalila wa Dimna. From there, it traveled further, entering the literary bloodstream of the Arab world and eventually reaching Europe. Its tales, reshaped and renamed, became woven into the fabric of European folklore, directly influencing collections like Aesop's fables. The clever fox or the persistent tortoise that you heard as a child may have ancestors that first spoke in Sanskrit. Every time these stories were translated, they were not just copied, they were reborn. Scribes would change the names of characters to sound more local, or swap out animals for creatures familiar to their own audience. The core lesson about brains over brawn or the dangers of greed remained, but the packaging was adapted for a new culture. This shared library of stories and philosophies created an invisible connective tissue across continents. A scholar in Paris and a merchant in Damascus could, in a way, be pondering the same fundamental questions raised by Aristotle, or laughing at the same essential joke from a fable about a trickster. It provided a common frame of reference, a shared intellectual heritage that made the vast, unknown world feel just a little more familiar and interconnected. The true value of a traded manuscript was never just its weight in parchment, but the weight of the world it could open up. Your clothing was once a map of the ancient world. Long before fashion trends circled the globe online, they traveled on the backs of camels and in the holds of ships, transforming what people wore from Rome to West Africa. Chinese silk created a sensation in ancient Rome. For the Roman elite, wearing this shimmering, almost magical fabric was the ultimate status symbol, a clear statement that you had access to the most distant and luxurious trade routes. Senators and wealthy matrons would pay fortunes for these translucent bolts, even as moralists complained about the drain of Roman silver to the east and the decadence of such delicate clothing. Simultaneously, another textile was making a global journey in the opposite direction. Cotton, first cultivated and woven in ancient India, was prized across the world for its incredible comfort and breathability. It became a staple from the hot markets of the Middle East to the shores of the Mediterranean, a humble fabric that clothed millions and became one of the most enduring legacies of Indian craftsmanship. But this exchange was not merely about bulk commodities. The smallest objects carried deep meaning. Intricately carved stone beads from India and brilliantly colored glass beads from Venice traveled across the Sahara to West Africa. There, they were not treated as cheap trinkets. Instead, local artisans wove these imported treasures into their own elaborate jewelry and ceremonial regalia, merging foreign materials with indigenous designs to create something entirely new and powerfully symbolic. A single string of Venetian glass beads around the neck of an African chieftain was more than an ornament. It was a complex message. It communicated his wealth, his access to vast trade networks, and his connection to a wider, sophisticated world. To wear a foreign style was to signal that you were a citizen of that world, a person of cosmopolitan taste and influence. Fashion became the most personal and visible canvas upon which the story of global exchange was permanently etched. A melody played on a lute in a 16th-century European court held the ghost of a desert song. Music, that most intangible of arts, flowed along the trade routes as easily as spices or silk, creating a shared soundscape for the ancient world. Instruments themselves were prized trade goods, and their journeys remade the musical traditions of entire continents. The lute, so central to the music of the European Renaissance, is a direct descendant of the Arab oud. The very name lute comes from the Arabic al-ud, meaning the wood. Traders and crusaders carried this elegant, pear-shaped instrument from the Middle East back to Europe, where its design was adapted, strings were added, and it became the heart of a new musical era. But the story of the oud goes back even further, to ancient Persian precursors, proving that a single instrument could be a living archive of cultural exchange. This was not an isolated case. The spiked fiddle, with its piercing, expressive sound, traveled from Central Asia, evolving into instruments like the Persian kamancheh and the European rebec, an early ancestor of the violin. The gentle, cascading notes of zithers, like the Chinese guzheng, found echoes in similar stringed instruments across Asia and the Middle East. It was not merely the instruments that traveled, but the very language of music itself. Rhythmic patterns from Africa, carried across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean, embedded themselves in the musical structures of the Arab world. Complex musical scales and modes, known as maqamat in Arabic and later as modes in medieval European music, provided a shared framework for composition and improvisation. A musician in Baghdad and a composer in Moorish Spain might be working within a surprisingly similar sonic palette, their creativity shaped by a common set of rules that had crossed deserts and seas. This sonic exchange created a rich, shared auditory heritage that transcended language and belief. You could hear the cultural echo not in a word or an image, but in a haunting melody, a rhythmic pattern, or the very shape of an instrument held in a musician's hands. The ancient world was not just a place of visual and intellectual fusion, but a chorus of interconnected sound, a symphony written by countless traders, travelers, and musicians across the globe. The seeds carried in a merchant's pouch held the power to reshape a civilization. While spices and silks were the stars of the trade routes, the most fundamental exchange was happening quietly in the soil. The global migration of crops represents one of the most profound and lasting cultural echoes. Citrus fruits from Southeast Asia began to flourish in the sun-drenched groves of the Mediterranean. Sugarcane, first domesticated in New Guinea, found a new agricultural empire in India and the Middle East before its journey west. The banana, an African native, traveled across the Indian Ocean to become a staple food throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. This was not a simple matter of planting a new seed. It was a complete transformation of local agriculture and daily diets. Imagine a farmer in the Middle East seeing his first orange tree, a fruit once so rare and exotic it was a legend. Now he could cultivate it, and this new crop would eventually become a symbol of his own region. Diets that had been limited to local grains and vegetables were suddenly enriched with new sources of vitamins and sugars, improving health and creating entirely new culinary traditions. A world without citrus in the Mediterranean or without bananas in Asia is almost unimaginable to us now. Yet these are all relatively recent arrivals in the grand timeline of human history, gifts from the ancient networks of exchange. But how could these new crops be grown in harsh, arid environments? The knowledge of farming had to travel alongside the seeds themselves. One of the most brilliant technological transfers was the qanat system, an ingenious method of underground irrigation that originated in ancient Persia. This was not a simple ditch. The qanat was a gently sloping tunnel dug deep into the ground, tapping into water trapped in mountain foothills and channeling it for miles to the surface without a single drop lost to evaporation under the desert sun. This Persian technology was so effective that it spread across the Islamic world from North Africa to Central Asia, enabling agriculture and supporting cities in places that would otherwise have been barren. The sharing of this single irrigation technique turned deserts into gardens, proving that the exchange of an idea could be as vital as the exchange of food. This fusion of new crops and new technologies created a powerful synergy. Increased and more reliable harvests led to greater food security, which in turn could support larger, denser populations. Thriving cities could emerge in previously marginal lands, their growth sustained by this imported botanical knowledge. The very landscapes were altered, as terraced hillsides for rice paddies or vast orchards of date palms began to define regions. The most enduring changes were not always written on parchment or carved in stone. They took root literally in the earth, sustaining civilizations for centuries and creating the agricultural foundation of our modern world. This legacy of shared growth, born from the simple act of a trader carrying a cutting or explaining a well, reminds us that our deepest connections are often buried just beneath the surface. A single conversation between a Venetian merchant and a Chinese official required a bridge built of human understanding. These exchanges were not carried out in a common tongue, but through the skill of cultural intermediaries, the translators and interpreters who made the ancient world intelligible to itself. Often emerging from diaspora communities, these individuals possessed a rare and invaluable gift, fluency in multiple languages and the cultural nuances that came with them. A Jewish merchant in Constantinople might negotiate a deal in Greek, then write a contract in Arabic for a partner in Cairo. A Nestorian Christian from Persia, fluent in Syriac and Sogdian, could act as the essential link between a Silk Road caravan and a local Central Asian chieftain. Their role went far beyond converting words from one language to another. They were explaining contexts, navigating delicate customs, and ensuring that a gesture or a phrase was not fatally misunderstood. They were the human software that allowed the hardware of trade routes to function, turning chaotic noise into coherent dialogue. Some entered this life by choice, building careers as respected diplomatic envoys or commercial agents. Others found themselves thrust into the role through enslavement or capture, their linguistic talents making them uniquely valuable to their captors. Regardless of their origin, their presence was the difference between a successful exchange and a violent confrontation. They were the quiet architects of trust in a world of strangers, ensuring that the flow of silk, spices, and ideas did not break down at the first cultural barrier. Without their unseen work, a Greek philosophical text might never have been translated in Baghdad, and a Chinese innovation might have remained trapped within its own borders. They ensured that every transaction had the potential to become a transformation, allowing foreign concepts to be not just heard, but truly understood and woven into the fabric of a new society. These hubs of exchange became the world's first truly global cities. A place like Samarkand, shimmering in the Central Asian sun, was far more than a simple stop for weary travelers. Its bazaars were a symphony of languages, where a Persian poet could debate with a Chinese scholar under the vaulted ceilings of a madrasa built by a Turkish ruler. The city was a living tapestry woven from the threads of countless cultures, each adding its own color to the urban fabric. This was not a chaotic clash, but a creative fusion. Local artisans, inspired by the intricate blue tiles of Persian architecture and the flowing calligraphy of the Arab world, developed a unique Samarkand style that still defines the city's skyline. The constant influx of new people and new ideas made these hubs inherently dynamic and adaptable. they had to be. To function, they developed a remarkable degree of tolerance. A merchant from Venice and a trader from India needed a neutral space where their different customs and faiths would not prevent a business deal. This practical necessity often evolved into a genuine urban culture of coexistence. The city itself became a mediator, fostering an environment where diverse communities could not only live side by side but also learn from one another. The intellectual energy was palpable. In Baghdad, during the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate, the city's role as the center of a vast trade network fueled its rise as the planet's premier center of learning. The famous House of Wisdom was not an isolated ivory tower. It was a direct product of this connected world, a place where the city's wealth, derived from commerce, was channeled into a massive translation project. Scholars of various faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, worked together to translate the knowledge of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians into Arabic. They were not just preserving old ideas, they were synthesizing them, creating new advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine that would later ripple out to transform other civilizations. This was innovation born from connection. A similar story unfolded in the humid air of Malacca, controlling the vital strait between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. This Southeast Asian port became a mandatory stop for every ship. On its bustling docks, the languages of China, India, the Arab world, and the Malay archipelago mixed into a new urban dialect. The city's administration had to be savvy, creating laws and customs that accommodated this incredible diversity to keep trade flowing smoothly. This environment turned Malacca into a cultural blender where culinary traditions merged, fashion influences crossed, and religious practices were observed in close proximity. The very identity of these cities was their diversity. They proved that when commerce brings the world to your doorstep, it does not weaken your culture. It gives it a new, more resilient form, a hybrid vigor that can lead to unparalleled periods of creativity and growth. The legacy of these ancient hubs is a powerful reminder that our most vibrant urban centers have always been, and will always be, works in progress, built by the countless echoes of those who passed through their gates. The old trade routes never truly vanished. They simply faded into the foundations of our modern world, and their outlines are still visible in the headlines we read today. Look at China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, a multi-trillion-dollar project weaving infrastructure and investment across continents. This is not a new idea. It is a direct and conscious echo of the Silk Road, a 21st-century effort to rebuild those same economic and cultural arteries, to channel the flow of goods and influence along paths first trodden by camel caravans 1,000 years ago. The strategic geography that gave rise to ancient empires still dictates global power. The Strait of Malacca, a narrow sea lane between Malaysia and Indonesia, was the vital throat of the spice trade. Today, it remains one of the most critical choke points on Earth, with nearly 1/3 of all global shipping, including oil tankers from the Middle East, funneling through its waters. Control over this ancient maritime highway is a primary concern for nations from Beijing to Washington, a reminder that the maps of merchants and admirals are often one and the same. Even our modern conflicts and alliances are haunted by these old connections. The cultural and religious boundaries established by those long-ago exchanges, the spread of Islam into Southeast Asia, or the division between Orthodox and Catholic Europe, continue to shape political identities and international relations. To understand why certain borders are tense or why certain alliances feel natural, you often have to look back centuries to the slow, patient work of traders and pilgrims. This means that studying these ancient pathways is far more than an academic hobby. It is a crucial key for deciphering the complex and often confusing geopolitical landscape of our time. The decisions made in boardrooms and capitals today are still being guided in unseen ways by the ghosts of old routes and the enduring echoes they left behind. The very structure of modern science is an echo from those ancient crossroads. While we often picture lone geniuses in isolated labs, the reality of scientific progress has always been a deeply collaborative, international effort, a tradition with roots sunk deep into the soils of the old trade routes. Consider the great translation movement of the Islamic Golden Age. In cities like Baghdad, a single, powerful idea took hold that knowledge was a universal treasure, not the property of any one people. Caliphs funded massive libraries and translation houses where teams of scholars, fluent in Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit, worked tirelessly. They were not merely copying. They were synthesizing, taking the philosophical works of Aristotle from Greece, the advanced mathematics and the concept of zero from India, and the medical knowledge of Persia, and weaving them all together into a new, more comprehensive body of knowledge. This was not a passive act of preservation. It was an active, creative process of building a new intellectual foundation for the world. When this enriched knowledge eventually filtered back into medieval Europe, it arrived not as a fossil, but as a living, breathing system of thought. The rigorous logical frameworks of Aristotle, now amplified by centuries of Islamic commentary, provided the essential tools for systematic inquiry. The advanced algebra of Al-Khwarizmi and the precise astronomical tables compiled in observatories from Baghdad to Cordoba gave European thinkers a new mathematical and observational language. The European scientific revolution, with figures like Copernicus and Newton, did not emerge from a vacuum. It stood on the shoulders of this giant, a giant that was itself a composite of Greek, Indian, Persian, and Arab intellect. The very methods that define modern science, the insistence on observation over pure dogma, the reliance on repeatable experimentation, and the crucial practice of sharing findings across great distances, were all precedents set in those vibrant, connected centers of learning. The international scientific community, with its global conferences and instant digital collaboration, is the direct descendant of those scholars in Baghdad who understood that truth has no borders and that the most profound discoveries happen when different ways of seeing the world are brought into conversation. The most powerful echoes are the ones we tell ourselves as stories. Long before goods were traded, myths were being exchanged, their core narratives flowing along the same routes as silk and spices. A merchant resting in a caravanserai might share a tale with a traveler from a distant land, and that story, planted in a new imagination, would take root and grow into a local form. Consider the story of a great, world-covering flood. It appears in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, where the gods decide to destroy humanity. It is central to the biblical story of Noah and his ark. And it echoes in ancient Hindu scriptures, where the god Vishnu takes the form of a fish to warn the sage Manu of the coming deluge. These are not identical tales, but they share a profound, underlying similarity. This could point to a common ancestral story from our deep prehistoric past, or more likely, it demonstrates how a powerful narrative traveled along those early trade and migration routes, being adapted and retold by each culture in a way that resonated with their own worldview and gods. Another striking parallel is the dragon. In the myths of Europe, the dragon is often a malevolent force, a fire-breathing beast to be slain by a hero like Saint George. In East Asia, the dragon is a benevolent and wise creature, a symbol of imperial power, reign, and good fortune. They are both dragons, yet they embody completely different values. This is the essence of a narrative echo. the fundamental concept of a powerful, serpentine, mythological creature traveled, but its meaning was transformed to fit the fears and aspirations of the society that adopted it. These shared stories reveal that our deepest human concerns are universal. The fear of divine punishment, the hope for a second chance, the struggle between order and chaos, the quest for wisdom. These themes were being explored in story form from one end of the ancient world to the other. The trade routes did not just carry the ingredients for our food or the words for our language. They carried the very archetypes of our dreams and nightmares, weaving a shared mythological heritage that reminds us, at the most fundamental level, of our common humanity. The flow of commerce could quietly upend a kingdom. For centuries, power had been a simple equation rooted in the land you owned and the noble blood you inherited. But the new wealth generated by long-distance trade introduced a volatile new variable: pure capital. A merchant from a common family, through shrewd deals in pepper or silk, could now amass a fortune that rivaled a duke's annual income from his estates. This new class of wealthy merchants wielded power based not on lineage, but on liquidity, and their rise sent shockwaves through the rigid social hierarchies of the ancient and medieval world. Suddenly, the traditional aristocracy found their authority challenged not by armies but by account books. Who truly held more influence, a count whose wealth was tied up in fields and forests, or a banker who could finance a king's war or cover a city's debt with a single signature? This economic shift was a profound social echo, proving that trade routes did more than move goods. They could rearrange the very architecture of power. The most dramatic examples unfolded in the maritime republics of Italy. In Venice and Florence, merchant families did not just influence politics from the shadows, they became the state. The Medici family of Florence began as bankers, their fortune built on financing trade across Europe. Over generations, they used that financial clout to effectively take control of the city, commissioning art that served as propaganda, marrying into noble families to legitimize their rule, and essentially governing as uncrowned kings. Their story was a revolution in slow motion, where economic muscle flexed itself into political dominion. This was not an isolated phenomenon. In the trading hubs of the Islamic world, powerful merchant guilds often held more sway than distant caliphs when it came to local governance. Their wealth built the infrastructure of cities, from canals to caravanserais, giving them a direct stake in political stability and the power to shape urban life. Even the samurai class in feudal Japan, a warrior aristocracy, saw its economic foundations shaken when merchant wealth began to rival their own, creating social tensions that would simmer for centuries. This slow-burning transformation demonstrates a universal truth. When new avenues to wealth open, they inevitably create new centers of power. The ancient trade routes were not just channels for silk and spices, they were engines of social mobility and upheaval, proving that the most enduring cultural echo could be the quiet, relentless reordering of a society itself. The pursuit of luxury carved a hidden cost into the earth itself. For every shimmering tusk of ivory that graced a royal court, a silent extinction was unfolding. The demand from Rome and beyond was so immense that North African elephant herds, once vast, were hunted to local oblivion. This was not an isolated tragedy. Across the trade networks, the hunger for resources reshaped the planet's very skin. In the Sahara, vast pits and trenches were gouged from the earth to extract precious salt, while in other regions, mountainsides were honeycombed with tunnels in the relentless search for gold and tin. These mines were the industrial scars of the ancient world, permanent wounds left by our ancestors' thirst for wealth. But the most unpredictable changes came from the smallest stowaways. When merchants traveled, they did not just carry goods, they carried life itself, rats and insects hidden in grain shipments could overrun new lands. More profoundly, the intentional introduction of new plant and animal species sometimes triggered ecological chaos. A foreign crop, brought to feed a diaspora community, could escape cultivation and choke out native flora, forever altering the local balance. A domesticated animal released into a new continent might outcompete indigenous species for food. These were not malicious acts, but unintended consequences of a connected world. The ancient trade routes, for all their cultural brilliance, teach us a humbling lesson. Our drive for connection and material comfort has always been deeply entangled with our environment, leaving behind an ecological echo that still whispers from forgotten forests and scarred landscapes today. A carpet woven in 16th century Persia carries more than just intricate patterns. Its very knots are a language, a dense code of techniques and traditions passed from master to apprentice for generations. These were not mere decorations. They were technological marvels, the product of specialized knowledge so valuable it became a cultural trademark, as recognizable as any royal seal. The legendary Damascus steel, forged from ingots of Indian wood steel, was famed for blades that were both incredibly hard and astonishingly flexible, their surfaces shimmering with a watery pattern. This was not a secret any one blacksmith could discover alone. It was a complex alchemy of temperature and craftsmanship that traveled along trade routes, a living science preserved only in the hands of a few. These crafts were both a product of trade and its very engine. A merchant did not just carry a bolt of cloth. He carried the reputation of an entire region, a guarantee of quality that made cities like Bukhara and Isfahan legendary. The knowledge itself was a form of wealth, fiercely guarded and meticulously taught within families and guilds. A young weaver would spend years learning the precise number of knots per square inch, the secret formulas for dyes made from insects and plants, and the complex geometric or floral motifs that told a story unique to their city. This was a direct, unbroken thread of human skill stretching back centuries. Today, when you see a master artisan hammering a piece of brass into a delicate filigree, you are witnessing more than a job. You are seeing an echo of an ancient economy, a living heritage where hands still perform tasks that were once the height of innovation. These preserved crafts are a defiant form of memory, a choice to hold onto a piece of the world that trade built, ensuring that the rhythm of the loom and the ring of the hammer continue to speak across the ages. A caravan captain in Baghdad and a shipmaster in Canton had to agree on a single moment in time. Coordinating the movement of goods across continents demanded more than a shared language of commerce. It required a shared language of time itself. The Islamic Hijri calendar, meticulously calculated on the cycles of the moon, became the official pulse of the Muslim world. Contracts were dated by it, debts fell due according to its months, and the rhythm of religious observances gave a predictable structure to the commercial year from Spain to Indonesia. Yet this was not the only timekeeper in the marketplace. The Chinese calendar, a complex lunisolar system, governed the flow of trade and agriculture throughout East Asia. In bustling ports, a merchant might need to juggle both, understanding that the new year in one system did not align with the harvest festival in another. This practical challenge pushed human ingenuity to new heights. Predicting the monsoon winds was a matter of economic survival. Missing the seasonal shift could strand a ship and its priceless cargo for months. This relentless need to read the sky fueled an explosion in astronomical observation. Observatories from Maragha in Persia to Beijing became essential economic institutions, their star charts and calculations directly funding the ships that plied the Indian Ocean. The calendar was not born from abstract philosophy, but from the desperate need to synchronize human activity across vast and empty geographies. It was a tool that allowed a farmer in the Nile Delta, a camel driver in Samarkand, and a sailor in the South China Sea to all move in a kind of harmony, their separate lives woven together by the silent, ticking clock of commerce. The ground beneath our feet holds the final, undeniable testimony to this story. While words and ideas can fade, a buried object endures, a stubborn piece of evidence waiting for its moment to speak again. Archaeology does not just uncover lost cities, it unearths the echoes of connection themselves. A single Roman coin, stamped with the profile of a forgotten emperor, found deep in a soil layer in southern India, tells a profound tale. It is not proof of a Roman invasion, but of an Indian merchant who trusted that small piece of foreign metal as a universal store of value, accepting it for goods sold centuries ago. Similarly, a shard of exquisite blue and white Chinese porcelain, unearthed from the ruins of a Swahili stone house on the coast of Kenya, whispers of a wealthy African trader whose taste and connections spanned an ocean. He used that bowl not as a foreign curiosity, but as a part of his daily life, a tangible piece of a globalized identity. Perhaps the most startling finds are those that defy our expectations of ancient geography. Venetian glass beads manufactured in the workshops of Italy have been discovered in pre-colonial burial sites in North America, long before any sustained European contact. They traveled not across the Atlantic, but overland, passed from hand to hand through vast indigenous trade networks that stretched from the coasts to the continental interior. Each bead was a treasure, its journey a testament to a web of exchange we are only beginning to understand, but the most complete time capsule comes from the sea. The Belitung shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Indonesia, is a stunning archaeological snapshot. This Arab dhow, dating from the 9th century, was packed with a breathtaking cargo of over 60,000 items from Tang Dynasty China, including magnificent ceramic bowls, ewers, and precious gold and silverware. Here was a single vessel, frozen in a moment of disaster, concretely linking the workshops of Changsha in China with the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East. This was not an abstract trade route on a map. It was a real ship with a real crew, carrying a real mixed cargo that catered to specific tastes in a distant land, proving that our ancient world was not a collection of isolated civilizations, but a deeply interconnected and sophisticated economic system. These silent witnesses, pulled from the earth and the sea, force us to listen. They are the hard evidence that the echoes we have been following are not just philosophical concepts, but physical truths, waiting for a trowel and a careful hand to bring them back into the light. The fascination with these old roads is breathing new life into them. A modern revival is underway, with artists and designers consciously pulling threads from the Silk Road to weave into contemporary tapestries. You can see it on fashion runways where traditional Central Asian embroidery meets modern silhouettes, and in art galleries where digital installations are layered with patterns from Persian miniatures and Chinese landscapes. This is not imitation, it is a fresh dialogue with history. Chefs are perhaps the most direct inheritors of this legacy, crafting menus they explicitly call New Silk Road cuisine. They combine spices like sumac and Szechuan pepper, techniques from across continents, and ingredients that once traveled these routes, creating fusion dishes that would have astonished a medieval merchant yet feel perfectly at home in a cosmopolitan city today. This creative energy fuels a desire to walk in the footsteps of those traders. Historical reenactments see camels laden with goods once again crossing desert stretches, while tourism along these paths has become a form of pilgrimage. People travel to Samarkand or the ports of Zanzibar not just to see ruins, but to feel the lingering spirit of exchange, to stand in the very caravanserais and harbors where the world was once woven together. This entire movement proves that the legacy of these routes is a living, breathing history. It is not a museum piece under glass. It is an active wellspring of inspiration, demonstrating that our current globalized world is simply the latest chapter in a very old story of connection. The past is not a foreign country we have left behind. It is a creative partner constantly whispering new ideas into the present. The words we speak and the food we eat, the faiths we follow and the art we admire all hum with these ancient echoes. Our civilizations are not built on isolated foundations, but on a rich tapestry woven from countless threads of connection. The story of these routes is a powerful testament to a simple truth, that our greatest leaps forward rarely come from isolation. They emerge from the beautiful, chaotic, and transformative space of collaboration and exchange. As we navigate our own complex global challenges, this history offers a quiet but insistent lesson. It urges us to look for the bridges, not the walls, to seek out the shared human ingenuity that has always propelled us forward. This journey through time reminds us that we are, and always have been, part of a larger conversation. If this exploration resonated with you, we would love to hear which cultural echo surprises you the most in the comments below, and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of our shared